Welcome. Today we're undertaking a meticulous examination of the sources surrounding one of the most defining industrial disasters of the 21st century,
The Macondo well blowout.
better known as the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Our goal here is to move beyond the headlines and really synthesize the core of the tragedy.
And what we found really wasn't a single technical failure, it was more of a perfect storm.
A storm created by systemic corporate negligence across three major partners.
Right, that synthesis is key. This event, which catastrophically began on April 20, 2010, is absolutely considered the largest marine oil spill in petroleum history.
And it's regarded as one of the largest environmental disasters the world has ever seen.
It is. The challenges were just immense. You had the sheer volume of the spill, but also its location, which was unprecedented, happening so far below the surface.
And it's so important to remember that before that flow of oil ever contaminated a single drop of Gulf water, the disaster began with an immediate and profound human cost.
We have to start there. It's essential. The catastrophe began with a blowout and then an explosion on the rig itself.
A massive explosion.
It was. 11 workers were killed that day and 17 other people were injured. This loss of life is the necessary, solemn context for everything we discussed today.
A fundamental failure of the safety systems that were supposed to protect them.
And their families.
This examination will follow the arc of that disaster, will detail the mechanical failures and, the underlying culture that led to the rig's collapse.
Then the staggering and, frankly, disputed scale of the spill that followed.
We'll also cover the often controversial containment and cleanup effort, and finally, the enduring environmental, health, and legal repercussions that forever altered the Gulf Coast landscape. So let's unpack the circumstances surrounding the Macondo prospect operation and the catastrophic failures that took place on April 20th. This was a high-stakes, deep-sea operation.
Oh, absolutely. It was pushing the boundaries of technology at the time.
And the vessel at the center of this was the Deepwater Horizon.
That's right. It was a 10-year-old semi-submersible drilling rig. It was actually owned by Transocean, but BP was the primary operator.
They held the majority share.
A 65% share of the Macondo project, with partners like Anadarko Petroleum and MOEX Offshore holding the rest. And it's interesting, it was operating under the Marshallese flag of convenience.
Which can sometimes complicate oversight.
It can.
And their location. It just speaks volumes about the technical difficulty they were facing. They weren't just drilling in deep water.
No, they were drilling extremely deep into the earth. The Macondo prospect was 41 miles off the Louisiana coast. The rig itself was floating in 5,100 feet of water.
It's nearly a mile deep right there.
It is. But the target for the exploratory well they were finishing was a staggering 18,360 feet below sea level. That's an environment of just crushing pressure and highly volatile gas deposits.
So on the evening of April 20, 2010, what was that moment? The moment that volatile environment became a fatal event.
At about 7:45 p.m. Central Daylight Time, high-pressure methane gas, which is the most volatile component of crude oil, surged out of the well.
It just erupted.
It expanded rapidly into the marine riser, that's the pipe connecting the well to the rig, and because of a failure down below, it shot all the way up to the platform itself.
Where it ignited.
Exactly. The resulting explosions engulfed the rig. It burned for 2 whole days before it finally sank on April 22nd.
The technical description is one thing, but the official investigations, they concluded this was preventable. What was the central diagnosis made by the National Commission about why the rig blew?
The central conclusion was devastatingly simple. The accident was avoidable. It resulted from clear, demonstrable mistakes.
And what was driving those mistakes?
A desire to save time and money. Both the White House Commission and the government reports that followed, they laid the blame on a systemic failure across BP, Transocean, and Halliburton. All of them making cost-cutting decisions and operating with inadequate safety systems.
So let's connect those dots. How did saving money translate directly into the physical failures that allow that gas to escape?
It was a domino effect of poor decisions. The very first failure was the cement job itself, which was provided by Halliburton.
That's the barrier in the bottom of the well.
Yes, and it was defective. It failed to create that necessary barrier. But the second mistake was BP's. They made the decision not to run a crucial diagnostic test called a cement bond log.
And that test would have.
It would have verified the integrity of that cement job. It would have told them it was faulty. Skipping that test saved them a significant amount of time and money, but it also eliminated the necessary confirmation of safety.
So they skipped the safety check, and then even when they got clear warning signs, they ignored them.
That's where the failure escalated rapidly. The crew conducted a pressure test that clearly failed. I mean, it indicated gas was leaking up the pipe.
But they misread it.
They misread the data, and instead of stopping, they compounded the error by approving the replacement of heavy drilling fluid, or mud, with much lighter seawater in the marine riser.
And that was to prepare to abandon the well temporarily.
Correct. But the lighter seawater simply was not dense enough to counteract the immense pressure of the surging methane, and that's when the blowout began.
And the final line of defense, the equipment designed for this exact catastrophic scenario, the blowout preventer, the BOP, it failed completely.
It did, that's right. The BOP, manufactured by Cameron International, was the ultimate failsafe. It was designed to immediately shear the pipe and seal the well.
But it didn't activate.
Investigations revealed it had critical pre-existing failures. There was a hydraulic leak and a failed battery. That combination prevented its shearing rams from closing fully. The joint investigation concluded it was poor risk management, last-minute plan changes, and a failure to observe those critical indicators.
All stemming from a rush to complete the well.
Yes, and that rush contributed directly to the loss of life and the environmental catastrophe that followed.
Once the Deepwater Horizon sank on April 22nd, what began as a human tragedy just morphed into an environmental crisis of historic scope. The well was completely uncontrolled,
flowing directly into the Gulf of Mexico for 87 straight days.
This period, it became defined by a massive dispute over the scale, over the numbers.
It did. Initially, BP's public estimates were drastically low. They started at 1,000 barrels per day, then moved to 5,000.
And this lowballing was critically important, wasn't it?
It was. Federal liability caps under the Clean Water Act are linked to the volume released. So the lower the estimate, the lower the initial perceived liability for the company.
But the reality on the seafloor was far different. What did the independent scientists find the true flow rate was?
The Flow Rate Technical Group, or FRTG, estimated the initial flow rate at a staggering 62,000 barrels per day.
62,000, compared to BP's 1 to 5,000.
It's a massive difference. The final total estimated discharge into the Gulf was approximated at 4.9 million barrels.
Which is about 210 million U.S. gallons.
Right. And to help you visualize that, 210 million gallons is enough to fill the entire Empire State Building more than 12 times over. It is a staggering volume that confirmed its status as the world's largest accidental oil spill.
An amount of oil like that, and it covers a massive area. Give us a sense of the geographical footprint of the slick.
The slick directly affected up to 70,000 square miles of ocean surface. That's an area comparable to the entire landmass of the state of Oklahoma.
The whole state.
The whole state. The coastal impact followed, of course, contaminating 491 miles of coastline across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida.
We tend to focus on the Louisiana marshlands, and for good reason, but the damage was incredibly widespread.
It was. Oil sludge and tar balls reached major tourist areas like Pensacola Beach, and it even crossed into the intracoastal waterway. Weathered oil eventually reached as far west as Texas.
But there's an even more alarming sign of the oil spread, wasn't there? In the water column itself.
Yes. A plume of dispersant-treated oil was found reaching a shelf 80 miles off the Tampa Bay region. It was actually causing lesions in some fish caught there.
And that showed that deep-sea currents were carrying the toxicity far wider than the visible slick ever suggested.
Exactly.
And that brings us to a unique aspect of this spill, the subsurface oil. Initial reports claimed that up to 3/4 of the oil remained below the surface. Why was that such a unique and dangerous problem?
Well, in cold, deep ocean water, oil doesn't just behave like it does on the surface. It doesn't just float to the top. It dissolves and hangs suspended in these underwater plumes. One such plume was mapped stretching 22 miles long, over a mile wide, and sitting 650 feet below the surface.
And that deep oil posed several long-term risks. What were they?
The first risk was the chemical composition of the Macondo oil itself. It contained an abnormally high level of methane gas, about 40% by weight.
Compared to what normally?
Compared to maybe 5% in typical oil deposits, and microbes trying to digest this methane, they rapidly consume oxygen in the water.
Which poses a severe threat of creating vast, oxygen-depleted dead zones.
Exactly. Dead zones that essentially suffocate deep-sea marine life that can't escape.
And this oil didn't just stay suspended forever, did it? It had to go somewhere.
It did. It eventually settled. This leads to what scientists started calling the dirty blizzard. Instead of floating up, the oil began clumping with suspended sediments in the water column and sinking rapidly to the seafloor.
An underwater rain of oily particles.
That's the image. And by 2013, scientists estimated that as much as one-third of the oil may have been mixed into deep ocean sediments. This geological threat traps the contamination where it risks continuing to enter the food chain for generations, seriously damaging sensitive seafloor ecosystems and long-term commercial fisheries. So, confronted with this unprecedented volume of oil flowing a mile beneath the surface, the response effort was gargantuan in size.
At its peak, it involved 47,000 people and 7,000 vessels.
It did. But it was also characterized by a series of spectacular technological failures, which really demonstrated that the industry was simply unprepared for a deep water blowout of this magnitude.
It sounds like they threw everything they had at the problem, and in the beginning, none of it worked.
That's very accurate. The early attempts were deeply frustrating for everyone watching. They used remotely operated underwater vehicles, ROVs, to try and close the BOP valves.
Which failed.
Failed. Then came the famous 125-ton containment dome, this massive top hat-like structure designed to capture the flow.
And that failed spectacularly.
It did when cold water and gas combined to form methane hydrate crystals, essentially ice, that just clogged the opening.
And then they tried one of the classic techniques, the top kill.
Yes, the top kill operation. It involved pumping heavy drilling fluids and then cement down into the blowout preventer. The hope was that the sheer weight of this mud would overpower the pressure of the oil and gas long enough for them to cap it.
But the pressure from the well was just too immense.
Far too immense. The operation failed to restrict the flow.
So what finally brought the flow under control after nearly 3 months of this?
Well, the temporary fix was installing a better-fitting containment cap that at least collected a portion of the flow. But the only true permanent solution was a method that just takes time. Drilling concurrent relief wells.
These are wells drilled adjacent to the main one.
Correct. They're designed to intersect the damaged flow channel deep underground. And while they waited for those relief wells, they achieved a temporary static kill in early August 2010 by successfully pumping mud down through that new containment cap.
And the well was finally declared effectively dead when?
On September 19, 2010. That was once the relief well cemented the flow channel permanently, sealing it from below.
Okay, wait a minute. So if they sealed it from the top and the bottom by September of 2010, why were there reports of continued oil slicks years later? Through 2011, 2012, and even into 2013?
That's a great question. And it was a source of massive anxiety for scientists and for the Coast Guard. They actually warned BP they might be held financially responsible for cleaning up this new oil.
And the slicks chemically matched the Macondo oil.
They did. There were two possibilities being debated. One, the less concerning one, was residual oil slowly leaking from the wreckage itself. But the more serious possibility was that it was formation oil escaping through a naturally occurring fault, possibly using the damaged well casing as a kind of conduit.
And if it was the latter?
It suggested an indefinite, persistent release into the environment, though at a much smaller rate.
Let's talk about the most controversial aspect of the response. The massive use of chemical dispersants, specifically Corexit. Once they realized they couldn't cap the well, the next highly debated decision was how to keep the oil from reaching the sensitive coastline.
And the scale of dispersant use was historic. A staggering 1.84 million U.S. gallons were applied. But what made this truly unprecedented was the first ever subsea injection.
They pumped it directly at the source.
771,000 gallons were pumped directly onto the plume at the wellhead, a mile down. The idea was to break the oil into fine, invisible droplets so it would stay suspended in the water column and hopefully biodegrade before it ever hit the shore.
But this decision had severe toxic ramifications.
Absolutely. Later studies confirmed the toxicity concerns were warranted. Researchers found that the Corexit significantly increased the toxicity of the oil by 52 times, in fact.
52 times?
Yes. Corexit 9527, one of the versions used, was known to contain carcinogens, hazardous toxins, and endocrine-disrupting chemicals. They were essentially trading a visible shoreline disaster for a massive, invisible, toxic subsurface disaster.
And what about the cleanup workers who were actively exposed to this chemical mixture? This is where the accountability failure becomes so profoundly personal.
This is one of the most serious failures highlighted by the investigations. The manufacturer, NALCO, advised in its own manuals that Corexit was an eye and skin irritant. It warned of risks of injury to red blood cells, kidneys, and the liver from excessive exposure.
And stated that workers must wear suitable protective clothing.
Yes. Yet cleanup workers in the Gulf were repeatedly not provided with the legally required safety manuals or the necessary protective gear, such as respirators.
So they were left unprotected.
Reports indicated workers were discouraged or even prevented from using protective equipment. They prioritized speed over safety, which tragically mirrored the initial corporate decisions that caused the disaster in the first place.
Besides the chemical dispersal, what were the physical efforts to remove the oil?
Physical removal was massive, but it faced enormous obstacles. They deployed 13.3 million feet of containment booms.
But they were widely criticized for being ineffective.
Very ineffective in anything beyond calm waters. They often washed ashore with the very oil they were supposed to contain.
We also saw those almost shocking images of them setting the ocean on fire.
Yes, that was combustion, or in situ burning. They literally set the ocean on fire in 411 controlled burns, and they successfully remediated about 265,000 barrels of oil that way.
It's effective for volume reduction, but there are byproducts.
Right. These burns released small amounts of toxins, including dioxins, though regulators argued the overall risk was marginal compared to the risk of the oil reaching the coast. Skimming was also used, with over 2,000 vessels, but so much of the oil was so highly dispersed by the Corexit that it was just too fragmented to collect efficiently.
And what about the natural cleanup? The microbes.
Well, while microbial activity did consume some oil, later studies suggested the microbes were primarily consuming the highly abundant natural gas. This means the overall effectiveness of natural bioremediation was likely overstated.
We now have to transition to the long shadow cast by this disaster, the lasting consequences across the Gulf's ecosystem, public health, and economy. The environmental impact was severe, reaching far beyond the initial slick.
The chemical damage to the aquatic environment was just pervasive. Water samples showed polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, a class of carcinogens, at levels 40 times higher than before the spill.
And these chemicals are profoundly toxic to marine life at every single stage.
Every stage. And the high methane content of the Macondo oil created an oxygen crisis. The massive oxygen consumption by those methane-consuming bacteria created an environment ripe for what we call dead zones.
Which threatens to suffocate entire segments of the deep-sea ecosystem that simply could not flee the area.
Exactly.
The effects on wildlife were immediate, visceral, and alarming. What kind of deformities were scientists finding in the early years after the spill?
The findings were heartbreaking, particularly in the sensitive larval stages of life. Studies documented severe cardiotoxicity in exposed fish, specifically bluefin tuna and amberjack embryos.
And these embryos developed what kind of deformities?
Deformities of the heart and other vital organs that were predicted to be fatal or, at best, life-shortening. The dispersant oil mixture effectively entered the microscopic food chain through zooplankton and crab larvae, and in the following years, mutated marine life surfaced.
Like what?
There were reports finding that 50% of shrimp were lacking eyes or eye sockets, and many fish developed visible oozing sores and lesions, which are classic signs of chemical stress.
And for the larger animals, the mortality rates were just staggering.
We're talking about an estimated death toll of over 1 million coastal birds. For whales and dolphin cetaceans, the mortality rate was so high it was officially classified as an unusual mortality event.
And sea turtles.
The National Wildlife Federation reported that sea turtle strandings increased from a normal rate of about 100 per year to roughly 500 per year post-spill.
Let's focus on the dolphins, particularly in Barataria Bay, which was one of the most heavily oiled areas.
The data from Barataria Bay was devastating. Nearly half the dolphins tested there in 2011 were found to be in guarded or worse condition. They were suffering from lung damage and immune suppression.
And then there were the babies.
Yes. More tragically, dead baby dolphins washed up along the coastlines at 10 times the normal rate during the first major birthing season following the spill. This suggested chronic internal contamination and severe reproductive failure.
The long-term geological threat, that dirty blizzard, is perhaps the hardest to wrap our minds around.
It's a terrifying prospect. If you can, visualize that snowstorm of oily, toxic particles falling hundreds of feet to the dark ocean floor. This traps the contamination, mixing it directly into the seafloor sediments.
And unlike surface oil that can evaporate or be skimmed, this deep contamination is sealed into the ecosystem.
That's right. It poses a persistent, long-term risk of continuing to enter the food chain for generations, affecting creatures from worms all the way up to commercial bottom-feeding fish.
And now we must turn to the devastating human cost, which extended far beyond the 11 lives lost on the rig. We are talking about the health crisis for cleanup workers and coastal residents exposed to that mixture of oil and Corexit.
The reports from the exposed populations paint a grim and extensive picture. Cleanup workers and residents reported an alarming range of severe chronic symptoms.
These included persistent respiratory problems,
Yes, and unusual internal bleeding things like blood in urine and rectal bleeding. Also seizures, significant memory loss, confusion, and observable liver and kidney damage.
researchers were sounding the alarm based on past
Yep.
spills, right?
Exactly. Marine toxicologists who had experience from the Exxon Valdez spill issued severe warnings. They anticipated chronic adverse health effects. They advised that cancers and neurological disorders should be expected among heavily exposed populations in the Gulf for years to come.
They understood the risk.
They understood that the combination of crude oil components and highly toxic dispersants was a catastrophic public health mix.
And the findings concerning children were absolutely horrifying.
They were truly shocking. A study focused on children living near the coast found that over a third of parents reported unexplained physical or mental health symptoms in their kids.
And these symptoms included
They included alarming reports of bleeding ears, nosebleeds, and the early onset of menstruation in young girls. That level of unexplained physical suffering confirms that this went beyond an environmental disaster. It became a pervasive public health emergency for the entire region.
finally the economic toll. The financial consequences for BP were historic, but the regional collapse was equally devastating.
By 2018, BP's total bill for cleanup, charges, and penalties exceeded $65 billion.
To put $65 billion in context, that's roughly the annual GDP of a medium-sized European nation.
It is. It's a staggering sum that reflects the total breakdown of risk management and the massive subsequent liability.
And what about the local economies that rely so heavily on the Gulf?
The regional economic damage was immense and long-lasting. The commercial fishing industry suffered initial losses of $247 million. The long-term projections estimated a total loss of $8.7 billion in overall fishery loss by 2020.
And tourism.
Projected lost tourism revenue reached $22.7 billion just through 2013. And the economic shock was compounded by the fact that these coastal communities were already heavily dependent on the oil industry itself, which employs 17% of Louisiana's state workforce.
After detailing the sheer scope of the destruction, the environmental toxicity, and the impact on human health, we now turn to accountability. How were the corporations involved held to account through the unprecedented legal actions that followed?
Well, the investigations laid the groundwork for this accountability. Government reports ultimately concluded that BP was the primary party responsible for the spill.
But they shared blame.
They did, sharing blame with Halliburton for the defective cement and with Transocean for the rig operation and maintenance. These reports led directly to the critical civil findings.
And the most pivotal moment in the legal process was the ruling by U.S. District Judge Carl Barbier. What was his specific finding regarding BP's corporate behavior, and why did that matter so much financially?
In September 2014, Judge Barbier ruled that BP was responsible due to gross negligence and willful misconduct. He explicitly described BP's conduct as reckless, driven entirely by decisions made to save time and money.
And the finding of gross negligence was critical.
It was. It meant BP was subject to far higher penalties under the Clean Water Act than if the spill had been deemed mere negligence. The blame was formally apportioned. 67% to BP, 30% to Transocean, and 3% to Halliburton.
The civil penalties were enormous, that $20.8 billion settlement, but BP also faced criminal charges, which is rare for a corporate disaster.
That's how severe the government viewed the conduct. BP pleaded guilty to 11 felony counts of manslaughter.
Directly related to the deaths of the 11 workers on the rig.
That's right. And they paid a $4.525 billion criminal fine, which was part of that massive overall penalty. Transocean also pleaded guilty to violating the Clean Water Act and paid $1.4 billion.
And Halliburton's contribution to the criminality wasn't just poor cement work. It involved hiding evidence.
Correct. Halliburton pleaded guilty to the destruction of critical evidence. They admitted to instructing employees to delete data related to the cementing job on the well. For that, they were fined $200,000 plus probation.
What about individuals? Were any executives held responsible?
It's worth noting that while some employees were charged individually, including site managers for manslaughter and an employee for obstructing justice, none of these individuals ended up serving prison time. Most received probation and fines, and others were acquitted. The focus remained heavily on the corporate entity.
Beyond the corporate penalties, The disaster exposed massive structural flaws in the government oversight mechanism itself.
It was a shocking revelation. The regulator overseeing offshore drilling at the time, the Minerals Management Service, or MMS, was found to be hopelessly conflicted.
How so?
They were responsible for issuing leases, collecting royalty revenue for the government, and ensuring safety and environmental enforcement. The government concluded that this agency was ineffective, lacked the necessary expertise, and often failed to recognize or challenge the dangerous cost-cutting decisions being made by the industry.
So the MMS had to go. What mechanism was put in place to fix that fundamental conflict of interest?
The MMS was dissolved entirely. It was replaced by 3 entirely new, specialized agencies in a major structural overhaul. The theory was that by separating these 3 conflicting functions, integrity could be restored.
Let's make sure everyone listening understands what those 3 agencies do, because the distinction is vital.
So the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, BSE, was established to focus exclusively on safety regulation, inspection, and environmental enforcement.
Okay, that's one.
The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOM, handles the leasing and resource management, deciding where companies can drill. And the Office of Natural Resources Revenue, ONRR, focuses only on revenue collection from those leases.
The idea being to eliminate that fox guarding the henhouse problem that characterized the MMS.
Precisely.
The change was sweeping, and it was certainly necessary, but the complexity of these drilling operations remains.
That's the legacy of the Macondo spill. We've detailed the immediate human tragedy, the technical failures driven by corporate haste, the long, arduous containment fight, and the enduring physical and financial toll.
And the investigations concluded that safety was repeatedly compromised for efficiency and cost savings, requiring both massive corporate penalties and a fundamental governmental restructuring.
And that restructuring is what requires our final reflection. The government took the right step in breaking up the conflicted Minerals Management Service and creating BSE, BOM, and ONR. This move aimed to ensure rigorous critical thinking in the regulatory process.
You should consider, does dividing responsibilities among 3 new agencies truly ensure rigorous critical thinking and minimize the risk of a similar catastrophic failure? Or does it risk scattering responsibility for complex, highly integrated operations across bureaucratic boundaries, making coordination and real-time intervention harder? Thanks for listening.